The sky above Cadia burned, not in the warm glow of a sunset, nor in the cleansing light of dawn, but in colours that had no name in any mortal tongue. They twisted and writhed, bleeding into each other like oil on black water. The constellations, those ancient points of reference for navigators, soldiers and dreamers, blinked and dimmed one by one. Somewhere beyond sight, the eye of terror pulsed, and its malignant heartbeat seemed to echo in the stone beneath the boots of every living soul on this world. They said Cadia was eternal. They said its walls would never fall, that its soldiers were forged from the stone of the world itself, unbreakable, unyielding. But those words belonged to another age, an age when the Emperor's voice was still heard in the hearts of his people. Now, the only voices were the ones carried on the warp-scorched winds, whispering promises and lies in the same breath. If you are hearing my voice tonight, I want you to know, truly know, that you are valued here. This is not just a story. This is a memory, a warning, a testament. We share this time together, you and I, across the void of centuries and stars. And before we begin in earnest, I have a small request. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, and let's get started. The fortress world was more than a military installation. Cadia was the linchpin, the gatekeeper of the Imperium's western reaches. Its soil had known only war for 10,000 years. Children were raised not on lullabies, but on firing drills. Men and women lived and died without ever knowing peace. Yet they carried themselves with a pride so fierce it bordered on defiance. From the command balcony of Casa Mirag, Lord Castellan Garin Varin stared at the shifting horizon. He was not a man given to poetry, but even he could see the symbolism in the bleeding sky. Every flicker of colour was a ripple of unreality, another wound in the flesh of the galaxy. He had fought here for 35 years, long enough to have seen a dozen Black Crusades. But this was different. This was final. His vox crackled. Reports flowed in like a tide, shield generators failing in Casa Kraf, outer patrols overrun near the Coral Spire, orbital augurs blind in Sector 12. And still, orders from Segmentum Command spoke of holding at all costs, as if the phrase meant something to the men and women who had been paying that cost since before they were born. Varin's jaw tightened. They had promised reinforcements, yet every day the relief fleets were delayed, their jump trajectories compromised. He had begun to suspect the truth weeks ago, but now the certainty gnawed at him like a cold worm. Cadia had been abandoned in all but name. His adjutant, Lieutenant Rian Vex, approached. Young, sharp-eyed, and still naive enough to think the galaxy could be saved, she stood at attention. "Sir, the 2nd and 3rd are requesting clearance to counterattack. They say the traitors have overextended in the northern trench line." Varin didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the far horizon, where the shadows of traitor titans moved like obscene gods. Each step they took crushed fortifications built over centuries. "No," he said finally. "Pull them back to Casa Holin. The trenches are gone. There's no point dying for a line that won't exist in an hour." Vex hesitated, her voice lower now. "Sir, the men are beginning to notice that we're not trying to win anymore." That struck harder than enemy fire. Varin turned to her, his eyes dark. "We were never going to win, Lieutenant. We were going to buy time. And I suspect now, we're not even buying that." The words hung between them, heavy as gravestones. From the balcony, Varin could see the first defense shield falter. Its flickering dome collapsed with a muted shimmer, leaving Casa Valis naked before the storm. The sight struck him harder than he expected. It was not the loss of a strategic position, but the death of an illusion. That shield had stood through 7 crusades. Now it was gone, and there was no getting it back. As the alarms began to wail, Varin closed his eyes for the briefest of moments. He imagined the galaxy 1,000 years from now, historians debating whether Cadia had fallen because of overwhelming force, or because the Imperium chose to let it die. In that imagined future, would anyone remember the names of those who stood here? Would it matter? He opened his eyes, and the horizon was burning. The wind over Cadia carried the taste of metal and ash. It scraped across the walls of Casa Mirak, tugging at banners that had once been bright with imperial colours, now dulled by years of smoke. Each gust seemed to carry faint sounds from the front, distant detonations, the staccato of lasfire, and the cries of men who had lived their entire lives training to die on this world. Lord Castellan Varin stood in the war room, surrounded by flickering hololithic projectors. They displayed the fortress world as a patchwork of red and amber sectors, each representing a battle already lost or in the process of being lost. At the center of the table, Cadia's capital still glowed faintly in imperial green, a lie of color, for even here the enemy's shadow loomed. Lieutenant Rian Vex reported from his side, her voice steady, but tinged with an edge she couldn't quite conceal. "Sir, the 8th Kasrkin Regiment reports heavy losses in the Spire district. They request permission to fall back to the inner wall." "Denied," Varin said, without looking at her. "If the Spire falls, the inner wall will be exposed on 3 fronts. Tell them they hold." Vex hesitated. "Sir, they won't last another hour without reinforcements." Varin's gaze lingered on the map. "Then they will last 1 hour." He felt her eyes on him, questioning, judging. She was young enough to still believe that war was about winning battles. She did not yet understand that sometimes war was only about losing slowly enough for someone else to notice. The war room's doors burst open, and Colonel Halbrecht of the 12th Armoured strode in, his uniform dusted with rubble. "Castellan, I need to speak with you, privately." Varin dismissed the aides. When the room was empty, Halbrecht leaned close. "It's the supply lines. I've received confirmation from my contacts off-world. Segmentum Command diverted our munitions to the Scarus sector 3 days ago." Varin's expression didn't change, but a heaviness settled in his chest. "They're stripping Cadia bare." "It's worse," Halbrecht said. "They're leaving us with just enough to make it look like they tried." The confirmation of what he had suspected for weeks felt like a cold blade under the ribs. This wasn't mismanagement or incompetence. This was abandonment dressed in the trappings of strategy. Before he could respond, a Vox officer stumbled in. "Sir, message from Casa Holin. They've been breached. Enemy forces are inside the perimeter." Varin's voice was level. "Order the 2nd and 3rd to move. Seal the breach." Vex's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "Sir, that will leave the eastern corridor undefended." "I know." Silence fell over the room. Later that night, Varin walked the ramparts. The wind was colder here, sharp enough to sting the skin. Below, in the trench lines, soldiers huddled behind shattered barricades, their laser guns clutched like talismans. The light from the burning horizon lit their faces in shades of orange and crimson. One of them, little more than a boy, caught his gaze and straightened, saluting with the rigid formality only the young possessed. Varin returned the gesture, though in his mind he was already imagining that same boy's name etched into the memorial wall. As he walked, he found Vex standing alone at the far parapet. She didn't turn as he approached. "I grew up in Casa Holin," she said quietly. "My family's still there." Varin said nothing. "I joined the guard because I believed Cadia would always stand," she went on. "I believed we fought for something that would last." "We fight for each other," Varin said at last. "That's all that lasts." She turned to face him, eyes bright with unspoken accusation. "Then tell me, sir, who's fighting for us?" Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. By morning, the casualty reports from Casa Holin confirmed the inevitable. It had fallen. The breach widened, and the enemy now poured toward the inner sectors. But the worst was yet to come. At midday, a courier from the Adeptus Administratum delivered a sealed data slate bearing the sigil of the Inquisition. Varin read the contents in silence, then locked the slate in a secure compartment. The orders within were clear. Imperial forces in Casa Myrak were to redeploy to orbit immediately, abandoning the planet's surface to the invaders. The reason given was strategic necessity for the wider theatre. No mention of Cadia's people, no mention of the billions who still fought and died in its streets. That evening, Varin stood again at the balcony, watching the horizon swallow another sector. He could feel the weight of the decision forming in his mind, whether to follow orders and leave, or to disobey and fight until the last stone of Cadia was ground to dust beneath his boots. For the first time in his life, he was no longer certain which choice would be the greater betrayal. The dust of Casa Holin still hung in the streets, choking the lungs of the few survivors who had scrambled from the ruins. Smoke rose in pillars like the fingers of some unseen, accusing god, and the distant rumble of artillery shook the ground like the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. Cadia was no longer a fortress. It was a wound, and every living soul on its surface felt the pain as though it were their own. Lord Castellan Varin moved through the shattered streets, his boots crunching on the rubble of what had once been proud avenues. Buildings that had endured centuries now lay broken, their stone bones exposed to the sky. He passed soldiers staring at the horizon with vacant eyes, men and women who had known nothing but discipline and war now confronting the terrifying freedom of survival, or perhaps the inevitability of death. He found Lieutenant Rian Vex at the edge of a collapsed trench. Her lasgun rested loosely in her hands. Varin did not speak. He knew no words could bridge the gulf between them now. The boy who had once greeted him with salutes was gone, replaced by someone older, hardened, a survivor of a reality more cruel than any drill or training exercise could prepare her for. "Sir," she said finally, her voice rough with smoke and fatigue. "They've taken the Spire district entirely. We can't hold it. We've lost contact with the 9th Kasrkin." Varin nodded once flatly. "Then we adapt, move the survivors toward the inner pylon, protect what we can. Everything else, we let go." She frowned. "That's not Cadia." He looked at her, truly looked, and saw the mirror of his own dawning despair. "Cadia isn't walls and trenches, Vex. Cadia is people. And the people who survive this will carry its spirit, even if the stones crumble." For a moment, silence held, as if the world itself paused to consider the words. Then the distant roar of a traitor titan cut through the air, a reminder that theory and philosophy meant nothing when faced with reality. Varin moved to a group of soldiers attempting to drag a wounded comrade toward an evacuation point. His voice carried across the street. "Keep moving. Every second you delay, more will die." He noticed one soldier, barely out of adolescence, clutching a las pistol like it was a talisman, His eyes were wide with the horror of understanding that this was no drill, no test of courage, but the real thing, the death of his home and perhaps his world. Varin knelt beside him. "I know it hurts," he said softly, "but fear does not make you weak. Let it sharpen you. Let it guide your steps." The boy nodded mutely, his lips trembling, and Varin felt the weight of every life he had commanded in that instant. It pressed down on him like a physical burden, heavier than any armor, heavier than any shield generator ever installed on Cadia's walls. Later, in the command tent, he studied the hololithic map again. Red markers now spread like a disease across the northern sectors. Enemy forces had penetrated every defense line he had spent decades fortifying. The thought that the Imperium's reinforcements had never intended to arrive burned in his mind like fire. The betrayal was quiet, almost bureaucratic. No fanfare, no overt action, but it was no less lethal. A messenger from the Adeptus Mechanicus approached. "Castellan, Magos Erath requests an audience. He claims there is a device, a protocol, that could evacuate select personnel from the inner pylon." Varin's lips tightened. He knew the Mechanicus dealt in secrets older than Cadia itself, and their protocols often came with costs measured in human lives. Yet he had little choice. Every option led to loss. Every choice carved pain into the flesh of the planet and its people. He followed the Magos to the inner sanctum of Kasr Mirak. Erath's face was hidden beneath layers of respirator tubing, and his robes bore the faint shimmer of anti-corrosion wards. "Castellan," he said, voice mechanical and cold, "what I offer is salvation, but only for some. Not all can be saved." Varin felt the old anger rise within him. And who decides who lives and who dies? Erath's hands twitched over a control panel, his voice almost mournful in its monotony. "The machine decides. It scans loyalty, capability, genetic integrity, and survival potential. I cannot alter its calculations without consequences. Those lost in the process will be erased from this world entirely." Varin clenched his fists. Every choice Cadia faced was a knife through the heart of its people. To save some meant sacrificing others. To save all was impossible. Returning to the ramparts as night fell, he watched the horizon shimmer with warp energy, the enemy closing in, the eye itself seeming to lean over the planet and stare. Somewhere in the distance, the cries of soldiers, civilians, and dying machinery blended into a single, unending lament. Vex joined him again, this time silent. She placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. "I don't know if I believe in the Emperor anymore," she admitted, voice low. Varin said nothing, for there was nothing to answer. Belief had no place here, only decisions, and every decision carved Cadia further into ruin. Above them, the stars flickered, dying in the light of the eye, a reminder that even in the cold vastness of space, nothing truly endured. The morning light over Cadia was muted, as if even the sun knew not to shine upon what was already dying. Dust hung thick in the air, and the acrid smell of scorched stone and burnt servitors clawed at the lungs of every soldier still fighting. Lord Castellan Garan Varan walked among the troops in the outer sector, his armor streaked with soot, his face set like carved granite. Each step carried the weight of decades, yet the weight of now pressed heavier than all of that. Lieutenant Rian Vex approached, her boots scuffing against the fractured pavement. "Sir," she said, voice tight, "the outer garrison reports enemy flanking units bypassing our positions. If we don't reinforce the eastern trench, the inner pylon will be cut off entirely." Varin shook his head slowly. "I know. orders have been made. Those we can spare are moving. He glanced at her, and she saw the fatigue in his eyes, the quiet despair no drill, no ceremony, no ritual could erase. I will not ask them to die in vain. Vex frowned. But sir, if the eastern trench falls, we risk total collapse. Even if they survive, they will be trapped, their deaths delayed, not avoided. He did not respond immediately. Cadia had never been kind to idealism, and every lesson he had learned in 35 years of command was carved into that truth. Sometimes, he said finally, voice low, survival is not about holding every wall. Survival is about making the moments that matter count. From the horizon, the sound of distant engines reached them. Not Imperial reinforcements, but traitor artillery. And beyond that, the unmistakable hum of warp energy that heralded the arrival of demon engines. Varin's fingers clenched on the railing of the parapet. Cadia's walls, once symbols of unbreakable resolve, were now fragile bones, and every second brought the enemy closer to snapping them entirely. Inside the command tent, Varin reviewed the latest reports. Supplies were running critically low. Munitions, rations, even water reserves had been reduced, redirected by Imperial authorities elsewhere. Evidence suggested Cadia's sacrifice had been premeditated. The cold reality settled in like ice in his chest. The Imperium had chosen not to fight for this world. They had left Cadia as a buffer, a shield against the eye, disposable in the grand calculus of war. A messenger arrived, breathless. Sir, I have an urgent report from the inner pylon. The engineer corps cannot maintain the defense systems. They require additional troops to operate the stabilizers. Without them, the pylons will fail. Varin's fists tightened. Every option was a knife's edge. Send troops to the pylons and risk losing more lives, or keep them on the front lines and let the critical systems fail anyway. In his mind, he traced the contours of Cadia's streets, the faces of the men and women he had trained, the families he had watched grow up in the shadows of these walls. Every choice tore another layer of flesh from his soul. Vex watched him, her eyes searching. Sir, you have to decide. Varin exhaled slowly, the first human motion in hours. We move them to the pylons. If the walls fall, at least some will live to remember Cadia. She hesitated. Even if it's only a handful. Yes, he said, even if it's only a handful. By mid-afternoon, the troops were redeployed. The streets that had once echoed with disciplined marching now ran red with mud, blood, and dust. The inner pylon bristled with desperate activity. Servitors scuttled over exposed circuits. Priests chanted litanies to keep the warp from devouring the machinery, and men and women of Cadia worked with grim determination to stabilize the failing systems. Varin stood among them, feeling the weight of each heartbeat, each breath. Every life here was a testament, a small rebellion against inevitability. But even as he observed, a chilling sense of betrayal gnawed at him. The reinforcements they had been promised never came, and the orders from Segmentum Command echoed in his mind like a taunt. Strategic necessity. Strategic necessity for whom? Certainly not for the people bleeding under the walls. Vex came to him once more, her expression a mixture of anger and grief. Sir, why would they abandon us like this? He looked out across the horizon, where the sky seemed to twist with unnatural colors, a reflection of the eye itself. Because loyalty in this galaxy is conditional. Because even the Emperor's will can be bent by the needs of men who never fought in these streets. Because Cadia, for all its pride, is only a line on a map. The lieutenant's lips trembled. And we are to die for it. Varen placed a hand on her shoulder. We fight, Vex, because that is what Cadia teaches us. We fight because that is what we are. If we die knowing we held true to who we are, even if the galaxy forgets. As night fell, the distant roar of titans shook the earth. The inner pylon hummed with unstable energy, each flicker of light a reminder of how close they were to total collapse. Varen allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking of the men and women who had trained under him, the families in Kasr Holin, the streets now twisted into ruin. He wondered whether anyone in the wider Imperium would mourn the loss, or whether they would simply mark it as a necessary sacrifice in the endless war. He closed his eyes and made a silent vow. No matter the betrayal, no matter the impossibility of their task, Cadia would not fall quietly. Even if the world itself broke, its defenders would leave behind a memory the galaxy could not erase. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the veil of stars, the Eye watched, and the universe trembled at the defiance of a world abandoned. The walls of Kasr Mirak trembled under the unending assault. The traitor artillery had learned to strike with terrifying precision, each volley sending clouds of dust and stone spiraling into the sky. The air smelled of ozone, blood, and burning promethium, a mixture that had become as familiar to the defenders as the taste of iron in their mouths. Cadia was bleeding, yet its people continued to hold, though each heartbeat drew them closer to oblivion. Lord Castellan Garan Varen moved through the command tent, listening to the reports with a growing sense of dread. Sector after sector had fallen, each loss a mirror reflecting his own helplessness. He had trained soldiers to fight, to endure, to die in a disciplined manner, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for being abandoned by the very forces he served. Lieutenant Rian Vex approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Sir, intelligence reports indicate that infiltrators have breached the outer pylon's auxiliary systems. They're moving quickly, and they are already inside, Varen interrupted. His voice carried the weight of finality. Tell the engineers to initiate emergency lockdowns. Every corridor, every hatch. They will find nothing unguarded. She hesitated, sensing the storm behind his words. Sir, if they succeed, the pylons will fail. The inner pylon could collapse entirely. Varen's jaw tightened. Then we will fight them in the corridors and in the control chambers. If the pylons fall, we die with them. But they will not take Cadia unopposed. The first signs of internal betrayal were subtle. Communications from the eastern sector, once reliable, now came garbled, delayed, or entirely silent. Soldiers reported orders that contradicted previous directives, and units once under strict coordination suddenly acted independently, or not at all. Varen began to piece it together. The Imperial reinforcements promised weeks ago had never been meant to arrive. The High Command's strategic necessity was, in truth, a calculated abandonment. And now, even within Cadia's walls, someone, or some faction, was undermining the defense from the inside. The lieutenant's voice broke through his thoughts. Sir, Colonel Halbrecht has withdrawn his units from the southern trench. He claims it's to protect the inner pylon, but it leaves the lower sector exposed. We could do as he orders, Varen said quietly, though his fists were clenched tight enough to whiten the knuckles. We cannot risk open mutiny when the enemy is already inside our gates. We fight where we can, not where pride demands. Even as he spoke, the first sounds of chaos erupted from the southern trench. Soldiers' shouts, the clash of chainswords, and the staccato of laser guns filled the corridors of Kasr Mirak like a horrific symphony. Varin moved toward the nearest breach, his armor stained with dust and soot, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the men ahead were already walking into certain death. Inside the corridors, the scene was apocalyptic. Fires burned unchecked, illuminating soldiers locked in hand-to-hand combat with infiltrators. Servitors whirred frantically to maintain failing systems, their movements erratic as the warp energy pulsing through the walls interfered with their circuits. The acrid smell of ozone clung to Varin's nose, each breath a reminder of the thin line between life and annihilation. Vex appeared at his side, las pistol in hand, her eyes wide but steady. "Sir, we can't hold them all." "I know," he admitted. "We hold what we must. Every second we delay, the enemy buys lives elsewhere. That is all we can do." They fought together in the corridors, moving from breach to breach, providing cover and encouragement, even as soldiers fell around them. Varin's mind wandered briefly to the families he had lost over the years, to the men who had trained under him and now lay broken, their loyalty repaid only with fire and betrayal. Hours passed in a blur of combat, smoke, and despair. When the smoke cleared, the lieutenant knelt beside a fallen squad, tears running down her soot-streaked face. Varin placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor of grief and rage beneath her armor. "This is the cost of defiance," he said quietly. "But it is worth it. Cadia does not yield easily, even to those who betray it." Later, in the war room, Varin studied the latest reports. Communications confirmed his worst fears. Units were acting without coordination, supplies had been redirected, and the inner pylon's auxiliary systems were compromised beyond repair. Betrayal had taken root within Cadia, and every choice he made now was a gamble with impossible odds. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of centuries of training, planning, and sacrifice press upon him. Cadia was dying, yet he could not abandon it. The Imperium had chosen to leave them to fate, but he, Varin, would see the defenders' courage carried to the end, no matter the cost. Outside, the night sky shimmered with unnatural colors, and the faint hum of warp energy threaded through the air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Eye of Terror watched, patient and eternal, and inside the walls of Cadia, betrayal and loyalty danced a deadly waltz, each step bringing the fortress world closer to the edge of annihilation. The air over Cadia had become thick, almost tangible, as though the planet itself were holding its breath. The horizon shimmered with unnatural light, twisting and folding in ways that defied comprehension. Warp energy bled into reality, painting the sky in colors that burned the eyes and whispered in voices only the mind could hear. Even the stars seemed uncertain, flickering like dying embers. Lord Castellan Garin Varin moved through the corridors of Casa Myrek with deliberate steps. The fortress world groaned around him, steel beams twisting under the strain of bombardment, walls cracking with the relentless hammer of enemy titans and demon engines. Every step carried the weight of inevitability. Cadia was falling, yet he refused to let its memory die unhonored. Lieutenant Rian Vex followed closely, las pistol ready, eyes scanning every shadow for the next intruder. She had grown into her role over the past weeks, her youthful naivete burned away by smoke, blood, and betrayal. "Sir," she said softly, "the Magos Erath insists on initiating the evacuation protocol. He claims it can save select personnel from the inner pylon before collapse." Varin did not respond immediately. The Magos' protocols were never free, and he knew the cost of tampering with the forbidden machinery. Some lives would be spared, but others would be consumed, erased entirely by the device's unfeeling logic. "I want to see it first," he said at last. every calculation, every potential casualty. If we do this, it will be because we choose it, not because the Mechanicum does. Erath appeared then, his robes a tangled array of servos and cords, respirator hissing softly. "Castellan," he said, voice mechanical yet tinged with something almost like regret. "The protocol functions according to survival algorithms. It will prioritize genetic viability, combat capability, and loyalty to the Emperor. All others will be left behind. I cannot alter the outcomes without destabilizing the device entirely." Varin's jaw tightened. "Then we decide who lives and who dies, Erath, not some machine." The Magos respirator hissed. "That is not possible. The calculations are absolute. Manual intervention risked total failure and the annihilation of all personnel in the inner pylon." Varin exhaled slowly. There were no good choices left. Every path was lined with death. Yet, as the distant roar of titans and the shriek of warp energies reached them even here, he knew that inaction was not an option. "Proceed," he said finally. "But know this, if this device fails, we will fight, every last soul, to the very end." The protocol began. Servitors scuttled across panels, wiry arms connecting power conduits to the ancient device. The hum of the machine grew, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floor and into the bones of all who stood near. Lights flickered in impossible patterns, numbers streaming faster than comprehension. The first personnel were drawn into the chamber, swept away in a storm of energy that seemed alive. Some screamed, some fell silent, and some simply vanished. Vex's eyes widened, and she reached out instinctively, but Varin gripped her shoulder firmly. "Do not interfere," he commanded. "Every life taken by this machine is weighed against hundreds who will live because of it." Hours passed like minutes, the ritual of salvation grinding on with inexorable precision. Every life spared left a vacancy, a shadow in the ranks of those who remained, a reminder of the impossible calculus that war demanded. Varin watched soldiers he had known for decades disappear, feeling the bitter pang of loss with each flicker of light. Finally, the protocol completed. The device powered down, leaving behind a silence heavier than any explosion. Those who survived were gathered in the inner pylon's central chamber, faces pale, eyes haunted. The rest were gone, erased as if they had never existed. Varin stood among the survivors, the weight of command pressing down like a tombstone. "We carry their memory," he said quietly, voice trembling. "Cadia's spirit does not die with its walls, nor with those who fall. We endure, because to endure is to honor them." Vex lowered her head, tears streaming silently. "Sir, will the rest of Cadia survive?" Varin shook his head, gaze fixed on the horizon where the enemy gathered for the final push. "Number, but we will make them pay for every inch of ground they take. And what we survive will tell the story." Outside, the sky continued to writhe with warp energies, and the faint hum of demon engines pulsed across the planet. The Eye of Terror watched, patient and eternal, as the defenders of Cadia prepared for the final, inevitable confrontation. Somewhere beyond the walls, betrayal, loyalty, courage, and despair danced together in a deadly rhythm, each note echoing across the dying world. And in the quiet moments between the storms, Varin allowed himself a single thought, almost a prayer, that when the stars themselves faded, someone, anyone, would remember that Cadia fought, and that it did not yield without defiance. The sky over Cadia had become a living thing. Warp energy twisted and rippled through the clouds, lightning fracturing the air with unnatural violet arcs. The distant mountains shuddered as artillery shells slammed into their flanks, and the shriek of demon engines tore across the horizon. The fortress world itself seemed to pulse, as if aware that its time was ending. Lord Castellan Garin Varen moved along the inner corridors of Casa Mirac, his cloak trailing dust and soot. Every wall bore new scars, splintered beams and pitted stone, a testament to the enemy's relentless advance. Each step brought him closer to the outer battlements, where the sounds of war were raw and unfiltered. Lieutenant Rian Vex met him at the junction of two shattered corridors, her face streaked with ash. "Sir," she said, voice sharp, "enemy units are massing in the northern sectors. They've brought a demon engine, horrors of the eye. If it breaches the inner pylon, nothing will stop it." Varen nodded, eyes narrowing. "Then we stop it. Here. Now gather the remaining Kassakin. Every corridor, every hatch, every choke point. We hold it until the last breath." But as they prepared, another truth settled like ice in his chest. Supplies were critically low, reinforcements non-existent, and the whispers of betrayal had grown louder. Orders from Cadia's own command structure had become contradictory, units withdrawing or freezing at key moments. It was no longer merely a siege, it was war within war. Vex's eyes searched his face. "Sir, are we being undermined?" Varen's jaw tightened. "Yes, and we have no choice but to adapt. If betrayal is a weapon, we will turn it back on them." The northern sector erupted in chaos moments later. Demon engines rumbled forward, their grotesque forms casting long, menacing shadows. Soldiers fought with desperation, holding choke points with laser guns, chainswords, and courage that bordered on madness. Varen moved among them, issuing orders, patching holes, and offering words of encouragement. Every face he passed reminded him of the impossible stakes. Every life lost echoed in his chest like a drum of judgment. Inside the inner pylon, Magos Erath oversaw the stabilization of the failing energy conduits. Sparks danced along the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of burning circuitry. "Castellan," he said, voice tinged with unease, "the warp energy is growing unstable. If the demon engine breaches the perimeter, the pylons may collapse entirely." Varen's expression did not change. "Then we hold it until collapse is the only option left. Every life we save counts, even against impossible odds." As the battle raged, Varen noticed a squad failing to follow orders, hesitating at a critical junction. His heart sank. In that instant, betrayal revealed itself. Colonel Halbrecht's units had taken an unexpected withdrawal, leaving a vital section exposed. The enemy surged forward through the gap. Vex turned, seeing the same truth reflected in his eyes. "Sir, they've abandoned their post." Varen clenched his fists, the rage and despair coiling inside him like a living thing. "Then we fill the gap ourselves. Every soul that survives will know Cadia does not surrender without defiance." They moved into the breach, leading the remaining defenders in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Chainswords tore through armor. Laser gun fire lit the corridors in staccato flashes, and the screams of the dying echoed like a symphony of agony. Varen fought alongside his soldiers, a living symbol of determination, though the weight of command pressed heavier than the armor he wore. Hours bled into one another. The demon engine was finally halted, but at terrible cost. The corridors ran red with blood. Survivors were few, exhausted, and haunted. Cadia's defenders had delayed the enemy, but only barely. In the aftermath, Varen walked through the ruins, counting the cost silently. Each name, each fallen soldier, weighed on him. Vex appeared at his side, eyes hollow but resolute. "Sir, How much longer can we hold them? Varin looked to the horizon, where the warp-scorched sky churned with unnatural storms. As long as we must, he said quietly. Even if the walls crumble, even if betrayal gnaws at us from within, Cadia's spirit will endure. Someone must survive to tell its story. The eye of terror pulsed above, patient and eternal. Inside the fortress, loyalty and treachery wove a deadly pattern, and Cadia's defenders braced themselves for the next wave, knowing the final confrontation approached. Every choice, every sacrifice, every act of courage or betrayal brought them closer to the edge of oblivion. And Lord Castellan Varin knew that when the moment came, only one truth would remain. The galaxy would remember either Cadia's defiance or its fall. The morning sky over Cadia was blood red, as if the planet itself bled in warning. Smoke from shattered cities and burning artillery crisscrossed with the strange, violet tendrils of warp energy, twisting the light into impossible forms. Even the distant mountains shivered under the relentless pounding of titans and demon engines, and every horizon trembled with the sound of the eye itself observing, patient, eternal. Lord Castellan Garin Varin moved among the surviving defenders in the outer pylon, his boots crunching over the dust and debris that had once been streets. Each step was a reminder that the world he had known, the fortress he had spent decades shaping, was unraveling piece by piece. Around him, soldiers huddled behind barricades, their laser guns trembling in calloused hands, eyes wide with the knowledge that this was no drill, no test of courage, but the true face of annihilation. Lieutenant Rian Vex joined him, her face streaked with soot and dried blood. "Sir, the Eastern Trench is under heavy assault. Reports indicate that several squads have either been cut off or withdrawn. We've lost contact with the southern barricade entirely." Varin's eyes narrowed. He had anticipated losses, expected casualties, but what gnawed at him was not the enemy. It was the betrayal within. Imperial forces that were meant to coordinate with Cadia had been absent, leaving sections of the fortress exposed. Every withdrawal, every hesitation, every failure to act had cost lives. Cadia was falling not just to the traitor forces outside, but to treachery within. He clenched his fists. "Then we hold what we can. Every soldier here will fight, every position defended. If the walls crumble, Cadia's spirit will not." As they spoke, the ground trembled beneath them. A massive demon engine tore through the northern barricade, its claws rending steel and stone alike. Screams echoed from the trenches, mingling with the war cries of Cadia's defenders. Varin moved to the front, leading by example, issuing orders with calm authority, though his heart thumped with the same fear that gnawed at every man and woman in those walls. Vex fell into step beside him, last pistol raised. "Sir, we can't hold them forever. Even if we fight to the last breath, the enemy will overwhelm us." Varin shook his head slowly. "Then we make our stand count. Every inch we hold, every life we save, it matters. Cadia does not fall, quietly." Hours passed in a blur of combat. The corridors became rivers of smoke and fire, of blood, and the scent of scorched metal. Varin moved tirelessly, coordinating counterattacks, patching breaches, and rallying soldiers whose courage was fraying at the edges. Every life lost pressed on him like a physical weight, and yet he refused to let despair govern his actions. Inside the inner pylon, Magos Erath worked feverishly to maintain the energy conduits. Sparks danced across the walls, and the hum of unstable warp energy vibrated through the chambers. "Castellan," the Magos said, voice tinged with fear, "the system cannot sustain this much longer. The demon engines are overwhelming our defenses. Evacuation is the only remaining option. Varin's expression remained steely, and yet some must stay to fight. Every second we buy is a second for others to survive. Cadia is not simply walls and pylons. It is the people who defend it. But betrayal struck again. Colonel Halbrecht's units, positioned in a key corridor, refused to engage fully. Their orders, half mysterious, half deliberate, had delayed reinforcement to the inner pylon, leaving a critical gap that the enemy exploited. Varin saw the northern barricade collapse and soldiers being swept aside. Vex's voice trembled. "Sir, they've abandoned their positions. We're alone here." Varin's jaw tightened. Rage and grief twisted within him, but he held it in check. "Then we are the line," he said quietly. "Cadia's defenders will not retreat. We fight, even if we are the last." The hours that followed were a cacophony of chaos. Demon engines roared through breached corridors, soldiers fought with every ounce of strength left, and the inner pylon groaned under the strain of failing systems. Varin moved among the chaos like a living shield, his presence steadying those around him, even as the impossible odds mounted. By nightfall, the northern sector was held only by a few scattered units, battered and broken but unbowed. Varin surveyed the devastation, counting the cost in silent grief. The betrayal within had left scars as deep as the enemy's siege, and yet the survivors still clung to the hope that Cadia's spirit could endure. He looked to the sky, where the eye pulsed, vast and eternal. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, the galaxy watched. Cadia's defenders had proven that even in abandonment, even in betrayal, courage could endure. But how long that courage would hold against the unyielding tide of darkness remained uncertain. And in that uncertainty, Varin made a vow. Whatever the cost, whatever the loss, he would see Cadia's name remembered, not as a fallen world, but as a line of defiance carved against the infinite night. The dawn over Cadia brought no relief, only a deeper, more oppressive shadow. Smoke and warp light filled the skies, turning the sun into a dim, fractured disk, barely illuminating the destruction below. The horizon trembled with the march of traitor titans, and from the eye beyond, a pulse of psychic malice rolled across the world like a tidal wave. Cadia's outer walls groaned under the relentless assault, cracks widening, steel bending, and stone splintering into ruin. Lord Castellan Garin Varin moved along the upper battlements, eyes scanning the chaos with the weight of command pressing down upon him. Every sector had fallen to some degree. Supplies were nearly exhausted, ammunition dwindling, and yet the enemy continued to pour forward, unrelenting. Behind him, the defenders looked to him for guidance, for courage, for a reason to keep fighting when all logic dictated surrender. Lieutenant Rian Vex approached, her face pale and streaked with grime. "Sir, Northern Sector reports are grim. Halbrecht's units have withdrawn entirely. They refuse to follow orders, claiming some excuse about preserving their troops. The enemy is exploiting the gap." Varin's jaw tightened. Betrayal had become a constant companion, a shadow lurking even within Cadia's own ranks. "Then we hold the line ourselves," he said quietly. "Cadia does not yield to cowardice." A sudden explosion rocked the battlement beneath him. He braced against the force, feeling the vibration through the soles of his boots. Soldiers shouted warnings, and screams echoed up from the crumbling streets below. Varin turned, scanning the advancing enemy. A demon engine, immense and hulking, clawing through barricades, its every step shattering walls and tearing soldiers apart. Behind it, a swarm of traitor infantry followed like locusts. pressing forward relentlessly. Vex's voice was tense. "Sir, we cannot hold them. Even if we fight to the last breath, the walls will fall." Varin shook his head. "Then we fight so they remember Cadia, so that even in defeat, our defiance cannot be erased." Within the inner pylon, Magos Erath worked feverishly, adjusting failing conduits, rerouting power, and attempting to stabilize the pylon's energy shields. Sparks danced, and arcs of warp energy flared along exposed circuits, filling the chamber with an almost unbearable heat. "Castellan," the Magos said, voice sharp with urgency. "The southern conduit is failing. If the demon engine breaches the outer gate, the pylon will collapse entirely. Evacuation is the only option." Varin's eyes were hard, his voice steady despite the storm around them. "Number not yet. We fight. Every second gained here is a second for those who survive elsewhere." And yet, betrayal struck again. Communications revealed Halbrecht had not only withdrawn his units, but had secretly aligned with a shadow faction within the fortress. His intent to preserve a select cadre at the expense of the wider defense. The walls that were supposed to unify Cadia's soldiers were now fractured by internal discord. Vex's hand tightened on her last pistol. "Sir, they've turned against us. How can we survive this?" Varin's jaw clenched, rage and grief coiling inside him like a living thing. "We survive because we must. Cadia's spirit is stronger than any traitor. Every corridor we hold, every soldier who fights, we honor the world that raised us. We do not kneel." The next hours were a maelstrom. Demon engines tore through barricades, soldiers fell in droves, and the corridors became rivers of flame and blood. Varin moved among the chaos, a pillar of defiance, rallying the living while carrying the weight of the dead in his mind. Every choice, every command, carried the impossible calculus of survival versus sacrifice. By nightfall, the northern sector was nearly lost. The inner pylon flickered under the strain of failing systems and the psychic assault of the eye. Yet Varin did not relent. His voice, low and commanding, carried to the remaining defenders. "We are Cadia. We endure. We fight. Let the galaxy remember that we stood against the darkness." Outside, the warp light pulsed like the heartbeat of a dying god, and the eye watched patiently. Within the walls, loyalty, courage, betrayal, and despair intertwined in a deadly pattern. And in that lethal tapestry, Varin knew that the final hour approached, the moment when every choice, every sacrifice, every act of defiance or treachery would decide the fate of Cadia forever. The horizon burned with unholy fire. The remnants of Cadia's outer walls, a jagged silhouette against the dying light. Warp energy flared through the atmosphere, and the sky itself seemed to writhe with malignant intent. The eye's psychic pulse pressed upon the minds of every soldier, every civilian, every soul within Cadia's borders, whispering doubt, fear, and despair. Even the stars above seemed dimmed, trembling before the wrath of an ancient, malevolent power. Lord Castellan Garin Varin stood atop the shattered battlements, cloak flapping in the sulphur-laden wind. He surveyed the destruction with grim determination. Below him, the surviving defenders clung to what little cover remained, their weapons trembling in exhausted hands, their faces etched with terror and defiance. Lieutenant Rian Vex approached, her boots crunching over the rubble-strewn walkway. "Sir, the outer walls are failing. The northern and the eastern barricades are gone, and enemy forces are flowing into the inner sectors. Halbrecht's traitorous units are openly collaborating with the enemy." Varin's gaze hardened. Betrayal had become a tangible entity, as lethal as any demon engine. Then we consolidate our forces, he said quietly. We do not flee. We fight where we must, and we die where we must if it comes to that. The corridors of Casa Mirak shook with the force of bombardment. Titan engines stomped across the outer sectors, their weapons unleashing devastation in rhythmic bursts. The walls moaned under the strain, fissures spreading like spiderwebs across steel and stone. Varin moved through the chaos, issuing orders, patching breaches, and bolstering morale, all the while knowing that every decision carried a brutal cost. Inside the inner pylon, Magos Erath's fingers danced over arcane consoles, sparks arcing in the suffocating air. Castellan, he said, voice tense. The energy conduits cannot maintain stability. The demon engines and warp interference are overwhelming our calculations. Evacuation, if still possible, must begin immediately. Varin's voice was steady, resolute. Then we buy as much time as we can. Every second matters. Every life we save honors Cadia, even as the walls crumble. The enemy struck again, surging through the breached northern barricade. Soldiers fought with desperate courage, holding choke points in corridors now filled with smoke, fire, and the screams of the dying. Chainswords tore through corrupted armor. Laser-gun blasts lit the air in staccato flashes, and the stench of ozone and blood was suffocating. And yet, betrayal struck hardest of all. Colonel Halbrecht, the commander entrusted with the inner sector, had fully aligned with the traitor forces. Cadia's defenses, once a coordinated web of strategy and discipline, now fractured under his deliberate inaction. Units failed to respond, retreated without cause, and in some cases turned on their comrades. Varin witnessed comrades being slaughtered, while their supposed allies stood idle or actively assisted the enemy. Vex's voice broke through his grim thoughts. Sir, Halbrecht's treachery is complete. There's nowhere to fall back to. We are alone. Varin clenched his fists, the weight of command a crushing presence in his chest. Rage, grief, and despair twisted within him, but he tempered them with cold resolve. Then we hold the heart of Cadia, he said. If we must die, we die together, and we will be remembered, not as traitors or cowards, but as defenders of the Emperor's realm. The hours stretched into a relentless night of carnage. The inner pylon shook under the combined assault of psychic energies, demon engines, and collapsing structures. Soldiers fell in droves, yet those who remained fought with a desperation that burned brighter than the dying light above. Varin led from the front, a bulwark against the tide, even as every corridor became a river of fire and blood. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, the outer walls were gone. The inner pylon, though battered, held barely. Cadia's defenders were exhausted, broken, yet unyielding. Every act of bravery, every sacrifice, every refusal to surrender had carved a memory of defiance into the stones of the world. Varin stood atop the inner pylon, surveying the devastation. The eye of terror pulsed above, vast and eternal, its malevolent gaze fixed upon the planet. Yet even in the shadow of annihilation, the spirit of Cadia endured. Though betrayal had struck from within and the walls had fallen, the people of Cadia had shown that courage could endure, even in the face of an unstoppable darkness. He allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the countless souls who had fought and fallen. Cadia was not yet lost, but the final confrontation, the moment that would decide the fate of the world, was coming. And when it came, only the choices of the living would determine whether Cadia would stand or be erased from history. The inner pylon trembled beneath the weight of the universe itself. Warp energies surged through its conduits, twisting reality into a labyrinth of impossible shadows. Cadia's defenders moved cautiously through corridors that seemed to bend and stretch, the walls alive with whispered voices, some human, some demonic, none entirely sane. The air burned with ozone and psychic tension, and even the bravest soldiers found themselves questioning the solidity of their own steps. Lord Castellan, Garin Varin, stood near the central control chamber, eyes locked on the failing energy monitors. Sparks leapt from exposed conduits, flickering across the room in chaotic patterns. Every display showed instability. Every readout screamed imminent collapse. Outside, the groans of war, metal on metal, the shriek of demon engines, the roar of titans, formed a relentless symphony of destruction. Lieutenant Rian Vex approached, her face drawn tight with exhaustion and fear. "Sir, the southern sector reports complete collapse. Units are either dead, missing, or aiding the enemy. We've lost all coordination. The inner pylon cannot hold much longer." Varin's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this, but knowing did little to dull the sting of inevitability. Every decision he had made, every command he had issued, now felt like a chain around his own neck. "Then we prepare for the end," he said quietly. "Every soul here must understand. The pylon may fall, but Cadia's spirit does not." Inside the chamber, Magos Erath's hands moved with frantic precision over the failing controls. "Castellan, the warp surge is increasing exponentially. The demon engines are feeding off it. If the pylon collapses, not a single soul will survive. Evacuation is no longer an option. Only containment, if possible, remains." Varin clenched his fists, rage and despair intertwining. "Then we hold it as long as we can. Every second counts. We do not abandon Cadia. Not now. Not ever." The corridors beyond the control chamber erupted in chaos. Enemy forces, both human and demon, breached what remained of the inner pylon's outer defenses. Soldiers who had fought valiantly now fell back under overwhelming pressure. Screams echoed through the corridors, mingling with the metallic shriek of war engines and the psychic resonance of the eye. Vex's voice trembled. "Sir, morale is collapsing. Half the units are ready to surrender or flee. The walls they are breaking." Varin's gaze hardened. "Then we give them no choice but to fight. Cadia is more than stone and steel. It is courage, defiance, loyalty. If these walls crumble, let the spirit within them burn brighter than any fire the enemy can unleash." Yet betrayal gnawed at them still. Reports confirmed that Halbrecht's faction had now fully committed to the enemy, actively sabotaging remaining defenses and redirecting troops to critical vulnerabilities. The line of defense had fractured into isolated pockets, each fighting not only against the enemy, but against the chaos within their own ranks. Varin felt a chill, the kind that seeped through armor and bone alike. He realized then that the fight was no longer merely physical, it was psychological. Every step forward, every command given, carried the burden of knowing that allies might turn traitor at any moment, that every life lost could have been prevented by loyalty now extinguished. Hours passed in relentless struggle. Cadia's defenders held pockets of resistance, each action an act of defiance against the inevitable. Varin moved through these pockets, offering guidance, reassurance, and at times, simple presence. Soldiers rallied at the sight of their Castellan, drawing strength from his unyielding will even as the corridors bled chaos around them. And then, in the midst of battle, the pylon shuddered violently. sparks and shards of stone fell from the ceiling, and the hum of warp energy reached a crescendo that threatened to shatter the minds of all within. Varin steadied himself against the trembling floor, the weight of command pressing down like an anvil. He knew the final confrontation approached, the moment when every decision, every sacrifice, every betrayal, and every act of courage would converge. He looked to Vex, to the soldiers who remained, and in that shared gaze was a silent acknowledgement. Cadia would fight to the last breath. Whether the walls fell, whether the Eye's forces triumphed, or whether the traitors succeeded, they would endure in memory, spirit, and defiance. For even in the shadow of annihilation, even as betrayal cut deeper than any blade, the heart of Cadia beat strong. And when the end came, the galaxy would know that Cadia had stood, unyielding, against the night. The inner pylon quivered as though it were a living thing, each shudder resonating through the hearts and bones of those who remained within. Warp energy surged unchecked through its failing conduits, painting the walls with jagged streaks of violet and green light. The sky above Cadia burned with unnatural hues. The stars themselves seemed to waver under the Eye's gaze, a cosmic reminder that the world below was on the brink of annihilation. Lord Castellan Garin Varan moved through the corridors with measured steps, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. Each hallway, each chamber told a story of loss. Shattered barricades, scorched corpses, and the weary eyes of soldiers who had seen too much, fought too long, and endured betrayals that cut deeper than any enemy blade. Lieutenant Rian Vex fell into step beside him, her voice low and tight with tension. "Sir, the outer sections are completely lost. Enemy forces are consolidating in the inner sectors. Halbrecht's treachery has become overt. He's coordinating attacks from within." Varin's eyes narrowed. Betrayal had been a constant spectre, but now it walked openly among them. Then we fight with the courage that Cadia has always demanded. Every second we hold here is a testament to those who gave their lives for this world. Beyond the walls, the sounds of battle were deafening. Demon engines screamed across the shattered landscape. Titans stomped forward like gods of war, and the clash of traitor infantry against the desperate defenders of Cadia formed a ceaseless symphony of death. Within the inner pylon, corridors trembled under the strain, and each footstep carried the echo of impermanence. Magos Earath's hands moved frantically over exposed conduits, trying in vain to stabilize the system. "Castellan, the warp flux is beyond control. The pylon's structural integrity is collapsing. We may have minutes, if that, before the core fails completely. Evacuation. Evacuation is impossible." Varin's jaw tightened. "Then we stand. Every soldier, every defender, every soul here will fight. Cadia's walls may fall, but its spirit will not." The first breach came suddenly. Demon engines tore through the northern corridor, their claws rending steel and stone, their presence bending reality with psychic resonance. Soldiers rushed to plug the gap, but exhaustion, despair, and betrayal slowed their advance. Some units refused to fight, while others simply disappeared into the chaos, their loyalty extinguished like dying candles. Vex's voice was tight. "Sir, the inner pylon itself is unstable. If the conduit fails, we are done. Nothing will survive." Varin's gaze hardened. "Then we choose what will survive in memory. Every action we take, every second we hold, is for those who cannot fight. Cadia may fall, but its courage will echo across the stars." The corridors became rivers of fire and blood. Soldiers fought with desperate resolve, knowing the end was near. Chainswords clashed against corrupted armor. Laser gun blasts lit smoke-filled hallways in harsh, fleeting arcs, and the screams of the dying resonated through the trembling walls. Varin moved from pocket to pocket, his presence a rallying point, his voice a command and a comfort alike. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the southern conduit erupted in a blinding flare of warp energy. The pylon shook violently, stone and steel splintered, corridors collapsed, and the psychic pressure of the eye pressed down like a tangible weight on the minds of the defenders. Soldiers screamed as debris fell, some caught, some buried, all touched by the certainty of doom. Varin's hand fell on Vex's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said, voice firm, even as chaos surrounded them. "The walls may fail, the enemy may overwhelm us, but Cadia will endure in memory. Every life we save, every act of defiance will be remembered. Fight for yourself, for each other, for the world we love." In the corridors, a final desperate defense formed. Soldiers rallied at his words, a fragile beacon of hope amidst collapse. Yet the truth remained. The inner pylon was dying, betrayal had fractured their unity, and the eye's relentless power pressed ever closer. Choices had to be made, sacrifices to hold pockets of life, decisions of who would live, who would die, and who would be left behind to face the darkness. Varin looked to the horizon beyond the failing walls, the blood-red sky marking the end of an era. In that instant, he understood the cost of defiance, the weight of leadership, and the unbearable burden of immortality. Cadia's fate rested in the hands of the few who remained, and when the final moment came, every decision, every act of courage or betrayal would be etched into the stars. The galaxy waited, silent and unyielding, for the fall of its first line of defense. The inner pylon groaned as if in agony, each tremor a dirge for the dying world it had long defended. Warp energy surged violently through the conduits, casting the corridors in jagged streaks of violet and green that danced across shattered walls. Cadia's remaining defenders moved like shadows, desperate and exhausted, their weapons shaking in hands raw from battle, their minds assaulted by the psychic pulse of the eye. Lord Castellan Garin Varin stood at the heart of the pylon, the weight of the entire fortress pressing upon him. Around him, soldiers huddled in what remained of the central chambers, eyes wide with fear and defiance. Every display in the command console screamed of collapse. Energy levels plummeted, structural integrity eroded, and the walls themselves seemed ready to buckle under the relentless onslaught. Lieutenant Rian Vex fell into step beside him, voice tight with tension. "Sir, southern corridors are gone. The enemy is pouring in from all sides. Halbrecht's traitors are coordinating the assault from within. We have nowhere left to fall back to." Varin's jaw clenched. Betrayal had become the constant companion of every decision. His eyes swept across the trembling defenders, seeing their courage and despair intertwined. "Then we fight where we stand," he said, voice low but unyielding. "If we must die, we die together. Cadia's defiance will be remembered." The first breach came with the roar of demon engines smashing through weakened walls. Soldiers fought desperately to hold the choke points, but exhaustion and treachery slowed them. Halbrecht's units struck from within, firing upon the very defenders they were sworn to protect. The corridors became rivers of fire and blood, echoing with the screams of men and women who knew the end was near. Vex gripped her las pistol tighter. "Sir, we cannot hold them. Not with this betrayal, not with the pylon failing." Varin's gaze hardened. "Then we make our stand memorable. Cadia's walls may fall, but the courage within them will burn brighter than any fire the enemy can unleash." He moved through the central chamber, rallying pockets of defenders, offering guidance, reassurance, and presence. Every act, every word became a beacon amidst the encroaching darkness. Soldiers who had faltered now found strength in his unwavering determination, fighting with desperate resolve, though each breath could be their last. And then came the hardest decision. The central conduit, the heart of the inner pylon, was beyond repair. If it collapsed, it would take the remaining corridors with it. Dozens of soldiers would die instantly. Erath approached Varin, voice strained. "Castellan, if we sever the conduit, we may save a fraction of the defenders, but many will be lost in the process. The choice, it is yours." Varin's heart wrenched. The lives of those who had fought, who had endured betrayal and despair, now rested on his decision. He felt the weight of the universe in that instant. The eye above, the traitors within, the dying planet beneath. Every second of hesitation was a death sentence. He closed his eyes briefly, letting memory and duty guide him. The faces of the fallen, the courage of the survivors, the honor of Cadia itself. These were his counsel. "Do it," he whispered. "Sever the conduit. Save what we can. And may the Emperor forgive us for the lives we cannot." Erath acted with mechanical precision, rerouting power and initiating the severing sequence. A deafening roar erupted as the conduit collapsed in a blinding flare of warp energy. Corridors buckled, walls cracked, and the enemy's advance was momentarily stalled. But the cost was immediate. Dozens of defenders were buried under debris, and the psychic shock of the collapse reverberated through the pylon. Varin stood amid the chaos, grief and rage coiling within him. He had saved some, but the price was devastatingly high. Soldiers stared at him with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and disbelief. The betrayal, the exhaustion, the unrelenting assault, it had all culminated in a moment that defined the fall of Cadia. Vex's voice, barely audible over the chaos, asked the question that no one could ignore. "Sir, how do we survive now?" Varin's eyes, hard and resolute, swept across the remaining defenders. "We endure," he said. "Not for walls, not for steel, not for glory, but for each other. And when the last light fades, Cadia's spirit will echo across the stars, remembered long after we are gone." Outside, the eye pulsed, patient and eternal. Inside, the survivors held their ground, defiant in the face of betrayal, despair, and the imminent fall of the world. The climax had begun. The moment when every choice, every sacrifice, every act of courage or treachery would define not just the fate of Cadia, but the legacy of its defenders. The inner pylon convulsed beneath the relentless assault, each tremor threatening to swallow the defenders whole. Warp energy surged through fractured conduits, casting jagged violet shadows across walls streaked with soot, blood, and the scars of battle. Cadia's last defenders moved through twisted corridors, their faces pale with exhaustion, their weapons shaking in hands raw from hours of unrelenting combat. Lord Castellan Garin Varin stood at the central chamber, the weight of the entire fortress pressing upon him like a living thing. Around him, survivors huddled in fragile pockets, clinging to life and courage in equal measure. Outside, the eye pulsed, a malevolent heart beating across the galaxy, warping reality and bending the minds of all who dared resist. Lieutenant Rian Vex fell into step beside him, her voice tight with fear. "Sir, the enemy is in every corridor. Halbrecht's treachery has reached its zenith. He controls the southern approaches. The inner pylon is failing. We cannot hold much longer." Varin's jaw clenched, his eyes hard as steel. Betrayal had become the shadow that haunted every decision, every command. "Then we fight where we stand," he said, voice unwavering. "Cadia's courage will endure, even if the walls themselves crumble." The first breach came with a deafening roar. Demon engines tore through weakened walls, clawing corridors into rivers of fire and steel. Soldiers fought desperately to hold choke points, but fatigue, despair, and betrayal slowed them. Halbrecht's units struck from within, shooting their comrades and further fracturing the defense. The corridors became a furnace of chaos, filled with the screams of men and women who knew the end was near. Vex's voice trembled. "Sir, we can't withstand this. The conduit is about to collapse. We have no choice but to fall back or die here." Varin's gaze hardened, a grim resolve settling over him. "Then we make our stand memorable. Every life we save, every act of defiance, will echo across the stars." In the central chamber, Magus Erath worked frantically over failing controls. "Castellan, the core is destabilizing. If we cannot stabilize it, everything, everyone will be consumed. There is only one option: manual shutdown and rerouting through emergency circuits, but it will cost many lives." Varin's heart wrenched. The choice was unbearable, yet necessary. "Do it," he said. "Save what we can. The rest, we honor with our resistance." As Erath initiated the procedure, corridors collapsed around them. Soldiers fell under debris, and the psychic pressure of the eye pressed down like an invisible vice. Yet the survivors rallied, inspired by Varin's unwavering courage. They fought with desperation, covering the Magos as he labored, holding the enemy at bay with every breath. Then came the moment of final confrontation. Halbrecht, the traitor whose betrayal had shattered Cadia's defenses, appeared amidst the chaos. His armor bore the sigils of the enemy, his weapons trained on the few remaining loyalists. Varin met him, eyes locked with the man who had brought ruin from within. "You've betrayed everything Cadia stands for," Varin said, voice calm but searing. Halbrecht sneered. "Cadia is a dying world. I choose survival over blind loyalty. You'll join the rest in history's grave." The fight that followed was brutal and swift. Varin and Halbrecht clashed amidst collapsing walls and the roar of warp energy. Sparks flew from blades and laser guns alike. Soldiers around them fell in fire and blood. Varin, driven by fury and the weight of every lost life, finally struck Halbrecht down, his betrayal extinguished in a final echoing blow. Yet victory was fleeting. The pylon shuddered violently as Erath completed the emergency reroute. Energy surged through the stabilizers, holding the core intact for a few fleeting minutes more. Varin looked to the surviving defenders. "This is our last stand," he said. "For every soul lost, for every act of courage, Cadia endures." The eye above pulsed with wrath, yet the defenders, though diminished, held their ground. Every corridor became a battlefield of sacrifice and valor. Lives were given freely to protect comrades, to maintain what little stability remained, and to resist the inevitable. By the end of the night, the inner pylon, though battered beyond repair, remained partially functional. The surviving soldiers, led by Varin, clung to the fragile beacon of hope in a world on the brink of annihilation. The cost had been immense, betrayal had cut deep, and sacrifices had left scars that would never heal. Yet through it all, Cadia's courage burned brighter than the flames consuming its walls. Varin, bloodied and weary, looked out over the ruined fortress. The eye pulsed above, patient and eternal. But in the hearts of those who remained, defiance glimmered. The climax had passed. The defining acts of courage, betrayal, and sacrifice had been etched into the annals of history. Cadia's fate was near, but its spirit would echo across the stars, remembered long after the walls had crumbled. The sky above Cadia was no longer a canvas of stars, but a churning void, alive with the eye's malevolent pulse. Warp energies raged unchecked, painting the clouds with streaks of violet, crimson, and sickly green. The outer and inner pylons had fallen, their ruins jagged silhouettes against the infernal horizon. The planet's surface was a mosaic of ash, fire, and broken steel, each shard a testament to the fury that had engulfed it. Lord Castellan Garin Varen walked through the shattered corridors of the inner pylon, each step heavy with the weight of loss. The surviving defenders moved beside him in solemn silence, their faces etched with exhaustion, grief, and defiance. Those who remained had witnessed betrayal, endured unthinkable horrors, and fought with courage that rivaled the stars themselves. Yet the cost had been immense. Entire units were gone. Walls that had stood for millennia were reduced to rubble, and the eye's relentless gaze pressed ever closer. Lieutenant Rian Vex fell in beside him, voice barely more than a whisper. "Sir, it's over. There's nothing left to hold. Cadia is gone." Varen's jaw tightened, the weight of command a tangible pain. He looked across the shattered landscape, across the fallen heroes and ruined halls, and felt the crushing truth of mortality. Cadia's first line of defense had failed. The galaxy had lost a bastion of courage, a beacon of hope. And yet, in the eyes of the survivors, he glimpsed something eternal. Defiance. "Then we do not die in vain," he said quietly, voice carrying the finality of centuries of honor and sacrifice. "We remember, we endure. Cadia's spirit is not the walls, not the pylons, not the fortresses. It is every soul who stood, who fought, who refused to yield." The remaining soldiers gathered on the central platform, overlooking the ruined cityscape. The eye pulsed above like a living heart of darkness, patient, eternal, and unrelenting. Magos Erath moved among them, circuits sparking and robes scorched, yet still steadfast. "Castellan, the energy conduits are irreparable. We cannot hold the pylon. The planet itself is lost. Survival is no longer possible here." Varen's eyes, hardened by grief and determination, scanned the survivors. Each face told a story of courage and sacrifice. Then we stand, not as soldiers of steel or masters of stone, but as witnesses to Cadia's defiance. When the eye consumes this world, it will remember not the walls we built, but the hearts that refused to break. The first tremors of final collapse shook the inner pylon. Metal groaned, sparks flew from ruptured conduits, and the psychic pressure of the eye pressed into their minds like a suffocating tide. Soldiers fell where they stood, some screaming, some silent, all touched by the inevitability of death. Varen and Vex held the line together, guiding those who remained with steady hands and unwavering presence. In the outer corridors, enemy forces poured in, yet the survivors fought with a desperation that defied reason. Chainswords tore through armor, laser guns fired until barrels glowed white-hot, and psychic resistance flared in brief, blinding arcs. Every act, every defiance, became a hymn to Cadia's courage, a message sent across the void that even in death they would endure. And then came the moment the inner pylon gave its final breath. The core collapsed in a violent surge of energy, tearing corridors apart, flinging debris and souls alike into the void. Varen held Vex's hand for a fleeting moment, eyes locking in a silent understanding. The end had come. The world they loved, The fortress they had defended had fallen. Yet in that collapse, in the echoing silence that followed, there was something eternal. Cadia's defenders, their lives spent in courage and defiance, became more than soldiers. They became a symbol, a memory that would ripple across the stars, a lesson to the galaxy that even in the face of inevitable annihilation, courage could endure. Varian closed his eyes as the final tremors consumed the platform beneath him. He thought of the fallen, of betrayals and sacrifices, of every choice that had led to this moment. Immortality was a curse for some, but he realized that even mortality, fleeting and fragile as it was, could shine brighter than the stars when coupled with courage. The eye pulsed above, eternal and indifferent, yet it could not erase what had been. Cadia had fallen, but its spirit, forged in fire, blood, and unwavering defiance, would echo across the galaxy for millennia. And somewhere, in the cold silence of space, the memory of Cadia whispered to those who would remember, "Courage endures. Even when the world dies, even when empires crumble, the spirit of those who fight for the light will never fade."